Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 327. Welcome back, Jordan Tyra. How are we doing?
I'm good, thank you. Good to be back.
Good, man. We're joined by Izzy Christiansen. Izzy, how's things?
Yeah, really good, thank you. Great to join you. That's a lot of podcasts, by the way. 300. How many did you say?
327th this is.
That's some podcast accumulation. That awesome work.
Thank you. Thank you. We've done all right. But this is going to be the best one yet. So no pressure.
Do you say that to everyone?
No. Just pressure on you.
No, I'm only messing.
I don't feel like I need to do a massive intro to yourself, Izzy, but there's loads of different ways we could take this podcast, from playing career to coaching to everything that you've got on in terms of punditry as well. But I want to start with Jordan and I have spoke a lot about the women's game and we've had a lot of guests on, and we spoke about the changes over the last few years in terms of the speed of the game, the intensity, and everything, how it's progressed. You've obviously experienced that first level. You've been out there on the pitch. So I wanted to start at that point, just in terms of when you started playing to when you finished. What were some of the biggest differences in terms of the game?
That's a great way to start. I think anyone who's a fan of football and watches women's football will know that the game has significantly improved at a rate of knots in the last sort of 10 years. And we are coincidentally experiencing the highest intensity of football in the women's game at the moment than we've ever experienced before. That obviously goes hand in hand with the increased investment, resources, professionalism of the game. So naturally, every footballer, every athlete, the more high level, high performance access they have, that correlates to higher performance, therefore quicker games of football, more intense games of football. And obviously now we're seeing a shift in the game where every team is able to compete physically. So we have 12 teams in the top flight in the Women's Super League. So I wouldn't necessarily say there's a huge gulf physically between the top of the league and the bottom of the league anymore. There is a gulf, but it's not as big as it used to be. So now, how do you find those margins to win? It's technical side of the game. So, 5, 6, 7 years ago, players who had an outstanding physical capacity, like, for example, Lucy Bronze, she's a machine, physically, up and down, right back, defying the modern term of an attacking fullback. She's had to adapt to her game in recent years to become more technical because, in short, other players were starting to be able to match her physically, with her pace, her speed, her strength on and off the ball. So that's an example of now, if you need to be, as a top flight footballer, you need to be physically elite, but you also need to be tactically and technically able to execute, the game plan that the manager's asking. So I think the women's game now, we're seeing a merging together of those factors. And, the speed of the game. There's one game that I remember this season already in the Champions League. Manchester City women hosted Barcelona in the Champions League group stages back in October. And it was the best game of women's football I've ever seen. The intensity, the speed of the play, the level of execution of a game plan from both teams. I'd urge anyone to watch that game if you want a little bit of an insight as to where the game's at right now.
That's really interesting, especially the sort of toss up between the physical side and technical, because we obviously speak a lot about the physical and everything that's been different over the years. We've had a number of guests on that have coached in the women's game from the top level, and they spoke a lot about the physical demands and the changes in the physical demands. But obviously that is now matched up, like you're saying, with the technical and tactical as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
For you as a player then, across your career, how much did that change? If we stick on the physical side, how much did that change your approach from starting to finishing?
Yeah, really interesting again. I was part of the England team where we were aiming to catch the USA, France, Brazil, Japan we wanted to become, as highly ranked as possible in the FIFA World Rankings. And this coincided with the change of the game in England. And we really hinged on the physical side of the game to bridge the gap. And we had, under Mark Sampson, who I played a lot of my England career under, he was an absolutely outstanding manager. He had a bit of a rugby background and an interest in rugby. And I'm a big fan of like cross-sport links. Like obviously tactically rugby and football are very different, but they are in some ways similar, that you can play for territory if that's the manager's style. And when Mark got the England job, he brought in a guy called Ben Young, who'd come from England Rugby. And he was, as a person, he was nuts, as in he was so hungry and determined and enthusiastic to change the face of English women's football from a physical point, from his department. So we went hard. We went really, really hard on training camps when we were with England, preparing for European Championships, preparing for tournaments. And then what we did was he filtered it down, he profiled everyone, and then made sure that what we were doing back at our clubs was called microdosing, where we'd constantly be in this sort of cycle where we were pushing for those 1% to bridge the gap so that we could play this sort of heavy metal football that Mark Sampson wanted to play, that basically was transitional and required fit people to play in that team. And I would say we were successful with it. And I think that what that did was it then marked a sign of the FA in England was ahead of where clubs were at in terms of professionalism. Now what we're seeing now is the clubs on a day-to-day have really improved their resources and their, performance mindset to make sure that your hub, your bread and butter, if you like, where you spend most of your career at your club, prepares you for international football. Whereas prior to that, it was international football demanding us at our clubs to go the extra mile every day to then prepare us for international football. I don't know if you're with me here, but we've now seen a shift, and clubs now, it's very, very specific. I would say it's like the men's game now. It's tiny little bits. And from your department's perspective, from an S&C, a lot of the work now is micro, is little things, or almost like injury prevention, strength and conditioning, as opposed to hard, heavy lifting, especially when you're in season. So that's always, and I did a degree in sport, physical education and coaching science. So it's always been something which has interested me as a player. And I always was that player who wanted to knock on the door and ask for more exercises, or can I do extra running, to try and find those extra gains. And it was at Man City where I kind of merged my physical desires and my ambition to kick on with my technical, tactical side of stuff. And then that coincided with me winning PFA Player of the Year. We won the league with Man City, we won the FA Cup. We did really well in Champions League. And I mean, I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but I was a big part of that team in terms of my goals and assists. And I knew that I was playing well because I was physically in a good condition. And it always says, if you ask any football player who's in form, in the form of their life, they'll always, probably the first thing they'll say to you is, I feel really good physically. So it's an area of football which is essential to feel good, to play good.
I think those players that have that intrigue about the physical side and want to do the extras and stuff, they're the ones that you want to work with, aren't they, Jordan? And Jordan, you'll probably say it's the wrong side of the city. Jordan used to be at Liverpool Women's a few years ago. Impressed with, but I'll bring him in on this now, because where you're talking about resources, where you're talking about development of the game, Jordan can tell us when he was actually in that role, because it feels like quite a long time ago now. But I'm guessing it was quite different then, Jordan, in terms of what is available now.
Yeah, I'll try and get the year right. I think it was 2016, 2017, and a little bit either side of that full season. And yeah, it's definitely changed massively. We've had guests on who have been at the club now, and there's a lot of changes which have gone on, and it coincides and echoes everything you've said. And I think the main point which I'm really glad you said actually, which we were feeling at the time in the clubs, because I was lucky enough to have that role at Liverpool, but I was also working on the FA Women's Talent Pathway with the youngsters as well. So, like you were saying, the FA was almost felt ahead of the clubs because the FA was. So my role with the FA was literally to go multiple weekends across the season and check in with all the really sort of the highly valued and highly talented players in a region, or you'd go and do a south or a north camp because they're essentially supporting the clubs. And it was a case of, right, the FA was almost pushing the clubs, like you said, to be, have you got, a physical performance coach in place? Have you got the coaching hours in place? And the FA would be sending representatives to sort of check in on that. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that the men's game does that a little bit, but to me, having seen both sides, it was never doing it as much as the women's game. So 100% echo what you said there, and that the FA definitely felt ahead of the clubs. And I just think it was the lack of resources, like you say, that the clubs probably, struggled to find the money potentially for some of those roles. And actually, it was one of the reasons I ended up leaving Liverpool late, because of financial stuff. So, exactly what you said, really. But like Ben said, I find it really interesting when players, like you said, they always say, "Oh, I feel good. That's why I'm playing good." How did you notice as a playing staff, like a group of players, did you notice some of the changes from an S&C sports science point of view across, let's go from 10 years ago, let's go from 2015. Did you start to notice sort of the integration of GPS, heart rate, and then it became, training modalities in the gym? It might have been more eccentric training, different equipment was coming in, Nord boards, things like this. Did you see those, change in technology? Did you notice it as players, or was it just, we just want to focus on playing?
Yeah, again, for somebody who was interested or is still very interested in the science side of the game and physical performance, I always took note of things like that. So I was very alert to the changes. Some players wouldn't bat an eyelid, and that's just the differences of people you have in the team. But when you get fined for not having your GPS, then that's when people start to notice, because it's so important. It's part of the game. It really is we are so lucky now. I mean, I work with an under 16 group now. I'm Man City, and I think our program is as good as a first team in the WSL. Our S&C coach, the attention to detail it goes into to plan the pathway for these young players to go and be a professional. And, there's even more light on that now because of where the game's gone and where the game can get to. And these players now, there's a lot at stake for them in the future. But I certainly noticed a difference because I was always that person who, like I said, if we got assigned a training program from England, I would do it. I wouldn't cut corners. I'd always make sure I got it done because I knew that somewhere deep down there was going to be I was going to profit from doing the hard work. It's always been a mentality of mine. It's something which I learned from my parents, without a doubt, two incredibly hardworking, inspirational people. And I think that's where now everything is kind of, I don't want to say put on a plate because I don't think that's fair to say, but just now because there's more resources and you go, you speak about like Nord boards and the eccentric side of, hamstring strength for footballers is probably, you guys know way more than me, but we speak about the epidemic of ACL injuries in football. And there's always a link somewhere along the way. And what we have now with regards to the equipment that you mentioned, I'm sure there's lots of other fancy pieces of equipment that are used. It's almost like stripping it down to what an individual needs. So, you might have one player who needs loads of focus on eccentric strength, and you might have a player who really needs to build up their quad strength. And it's like the numbers and the science that goes behind that is just insane. It's mind-blowing. And it might just be a certain player needs to do 3 eccentric hamstring exercises after every training day. And there's literally all the player needs to know is that they need to do that. Some players you will get that ask why. And you'll always find that anyone that's worked in the women's game will always say the women or the female players are a little bit more inquisitive to know why they're doing something. Whereas if you told like Kevin De Bruyne or, Bruno Fernandes or whatever, like 2 hamstring Nord boards, please, at the end of training, Bruno, and you'd be like, yeah, sound, like I'll get it done. You won't ask why. So you'll always find that working with females, and a lot of people that I know and have been, connected with throughout the game there's always that inquisition of why we're doing something, and they want to know exactly why they're doing it and why it's going to help them. And then ultimately, like with anything, like everyone just wants to see results, and you want to see how things are helping you. And sport now, modern sport, is more so about injury prevention rather than gains, I suppose. You know, gains for the off season, physical strength, and then it's about ticking over and making sure that you're at your optimum throughout the season. But yeah, it's changed a lot since I was involved, and I'm really lucky to be, you know, connected with it. Even though I'm recently out of the game, I'm super connected with it at the moment in what I do, and you know, very interested in the latest technology and the latest sort of methods to find those margins.
It's interesting, and obviously we speak about the actual game, but there's a lot more in terms of the progression with fixtures and all the rest of it as well, isn't there? We talk about congestion, you talk about microdosing, recovering, and not having that time. It's becoming even more like evident in the women's game, isn't it? Now that the weeks are getting packed out with fixtures, the competitions, Champions League, you've got a lot of other competitions going on. So it's a lot of the discussions that we've had on the podcast are in line with that as well. I wanted to just take you back to when you were talking about your experiences with sports science S&C, and obviously you were a player like a sponge that wanted to take on as much information as possible. But with your experiences, you mentioned Ben before, I'm sure there's other practitioners that you've worked with. What were some traits that you found that you could really relate to practitioners? Because I want to give advice to the listeners here in terms of, we're going to have a lot of sports scientists, a lot of S&Cs. You as a player, when you were having conversations with a coach, an S&C coach or a sports scientist, what was it that made you go, actually, I'm going to listen to this person, I'm going to take on the information that they're going to give me?
That's such a good question. I'm really trying to think to I played at Man City, Everton, Lyon, obviously played for England as well. Played for Birmingham City, where resources were very few and far between. So there was always there we had to sort of connect, and they kind of used the sort of a Moneyball approach with that at the club at the time. And then gone into a really professional environment at Man City. And I go back to a sports scientist that worked with us there. She worked with Phil Foden as well when he was coming through the academy. Her name's Elle Turner. And she will, if you ask any of the Manchester City squad, myself, Jill Scott, Steph Horton, Karen Bardsley, Lucy Bronze, Demi Stokes, you know, who the best sports scientists we worked with, will probably say her, because her attention to detail was second to none. She was, I'd probably call it tough love. This coincided with a time where we had one mission at Man City, where we were formed as Man City women. The Super League was formed. We had a controversial entry into the Women's Super League. We people will say on the outside we bought ourselves in, when actually we set a precedent for the women's game to be improved. So it's funny how things spin around, but we basically had a job to do, and our job was to change the perception of women's football. So number one, targeted physical performance. We needed to get super fit so we could play at a faster intensity, better football, more exciting for the fans, more bums on seats, more people come back, more revenue, more interest in the women's game. So that's a little whistle stop. But Elle Turner, what she did was, I'll be honest with you, she made me cry during a yo-yo test once. I was in the middle of writing my dissertation and I was in a very bad way, stressed. But that's not why she was good. I wouldn't recommend that. It's more around tough love. Just we had so much trust. It's really difficult for me to describe exactly what it was. Consistency. The drills that she put on, she had a big focus on athletic development drills, position specific. So we used to have this window at the start of 2 or 3 training sessions a week where it was designated to positional specific athletic development. So if you had a camera now, a lot of football training pitches have a camera now that looks down onto the training pitch for coaches and analysts to clip up sections of training. If you look down on those athletic development sessions, you'd probably be like, what on earth are they doing? Because it just looked like a load of people running in random directions on a pitch. And actually what it was midfielders were doing sort of up, press, drop off to receive, move your hips, get in a position to receive the ball, turn, play forward, sprint that way. But it was all designed around what movements we would find ourselves doing in the Man City methodology on the pitch, in the area of the pitch that we'd perform those types of movements. So that was something big. I wouldn't necessarily say it's groundbreaking, but it was very good because it was consistent and it really got that buy-in from the group. I've worked with other practitioners since then who, one I know now is at Arsenal. He was super consistent, just so consistent as a human, with his programming, with his adherence to accels, decels, as terms of what we needed to do to prepare ourselves, to perform at the way that the manager wanted us to play at. Because I imagine now at the very top level, that's why a lot of, Premier League clubs, managers, they come in, they go out, they normally take their team with them because they have that trust in what that practitioner does in that area that links to their philosophy of football. So it's all very fine line. But I would just say the consistency, the detail, and also I think it comes with any business. It's management of people as well. Like, you'll know, George, about females, you probably agree, but females ask always why. But if you, as a practitioner, as a staff member, give away or give the players too much information, you might end up leaving yourself quite open to more questions. And it's all about, streamlined focus. When you're in the building, that's precious time. The prerogative really is, as a coach and as staff members, is to get the players in and out as quickly as possible in the working day, but maximising working time. So if you leave a lot of space for, I call it fluff conversations, fluff chit chat, I always think, what's the goal? Okay, the goal's to win. Okay, how are we going to get there? And then that's just the way I think. So I think with Elle, with Jack, and then the guy I work with at the moment, Ross Wally at Man City, I mean, I won't be surprised if he's in a first team in a matter of time, because just the genuine passion and enthusiasm for what you do as well, super important.
I think there's some key stuff in there, Jordan, isn't there? Because we always like asking that, especially someone like yourself that has got that interest in the sports science and S&C side. You're going to see through a lot of bullshit. So if anyone's trying to blag
yeah,
you're going to know, aren't you? So I think it's interesting to get your perspective. I think the other side of it is, and this is obviously, you don't have to dig anyone out and mention any names, but for young practitioners, on the opposite side of that, what are some things, and not just you, but maybe open it? I know you don't want to speak on behalf of teammates, but what would it be if a coach came in and did whatever they were going to do that would then have the opposite effect, and the girls would be like, I'm not really buying into this person?
Well, I've been in that situation before, actually. A very, different cultural style came into our football club. To be honest with you, playing in France taught me so much. And also, you guys will hate to hear this, but in France, S&C was in the bin. We English girls, so it was me, Lucy Bronze, and Alex Greenwood at Lyon at the same time, doing these pieces of microdosing that Ben Young had asked us to do. And we'd sneak into the gym. And then we'd come out of the gym, and Toto at the time, Toto is the name of our physical performance coach at Lyon. He'd be like, what have you been doing? Where have you been? And we were like, lifting weights. And so it was frowned upon there. It was almost like legs, bums and tums circuit class at Lyon. And it was that was a big cultural shift for us to get used to. And then I flip it and go, at Everton, we had a French coach that came in, and he brought some French staff with him. And we were then exposed to a completely different physical program mid-season, and everyone's fitness levels dropped, and the numbers back that. We were out on the grass for 2.5 hours, but moving time was hardly anything. And then gym was different, and we started picking up more injuries as a group. And then it was, you can imagine, like, you guys know the importance of consistency in the industry, and things just completely were flipped on their head. And we were then starting to get poor results on the pitch. And then, you know, it was a bit of a, well, how do I call it? It was a mismatch. It was a mismatch at the time. And then the club addressed the issues and you know, things changed in due course. But it shows the other side of it, you know, how important it is. And you work so hard to get yourselves in a good physical performance condition. And then it can take a matter of weeks for that deconditioning to start. And then when you're footballers, all you want to do is win football matches and be able to compete. When that starts to change, it really affects morale and culture. And you can imagine any business, if you've got 20 females in a dressing room, you might have issues. So who are all unhappy, you might have issues. So that's what we experienced. So I've been very lucky that I've been experienced to a lot of different scenarios, which I would probably say in what I'm doing now really do help me in terms of understanding how culture and how environments should work.
I think you've raised a really important point there for certainly, again, young practitioners or any practitioner, to be honest, that you need to appreciate the culture of the environment you're going into, don't you? Because as we know, consistency, as you mentioned it many, many times there, was one of the strongest traits of sort of the S&C programs that you've been part of. So if you're coming into a new environment and going, oh, we're going to change it all up now, we're going to do it our way, chances are you might get lucky, but chances are it might go on a bit of a rocky path. And that, again, we've seen it. We had quite a few guests on here who have worked abroad, worked in Spain, worked in France, and every country has a very, very different philosophy towards S&C. And we're fortunate now to work with players who have, worked in different countries, and they say the exact same thing. So again, I think for the coaches potentially going into a new environment or potentially moving abroad, I think that's a golden point you've raised there to appreciate that if you're going into a new country, a new slightly different way of doing things, and you try and bring, it worked over here, so I'm just going to drop it in there, it probably won't. It probably won't. So I think it's hilarious that I think we'd like more players to try and sneak into the gym to do their gym work. It's usually the other way around. Usually they're sneaking out the gym, aren't they?
That's what I was going to say. Normally people are sneaking out the gym, but we were sneaking in because we believed in it and we bought into it. And we English girls, we've been lifting. And I was actually, way back when, I used to go to Old Sager in Crewe. I lived in Macclesfield. I was playing for Everton, but I used to have to do FA strength and conditioning sessions twice a week. And they were like an extra, but I and my mum saw real benefit in that. And I basically was exposed to S&C from a very young age. And the consistency of it is something which has always been part of my life. And people ask me now, did you ever have an ACL injury in your career? And I never did. And I only had a bad leg break and a bad ankle ligament damage. So I don't know whether it's luck, whether it's care, there's so many different factors involved, but my gut is telling me that because I was super diligent and consistent with the micro parts of training, looking after my body, my knees, my ankles, that might have been why I didn't have a serious injury. But again, hindsight is a wonderful thing. I could be totally wrong with that, but that was my gut.
Is there anything on reflection, Izzy? I don't think there will be, because it sounds like you pretty much left no stone unturned in your preparation, which is always the best type of players to work with. The ones that's a lot of the time, Jordan, that you actually have to pull back, don't you, and say, right, you don't need to do anything else today. Go home.
Go home.
Go home. Go and put your feet up. Is there anything, especially with your experience in coaching now, is there anything on reflection that you would have either spent more time on, you'd have spent less time on, you'd have maybe added in or taken out?
No, because actually when I finish, you hear like loads of people saying, like, if you're asking a manager or a coach to describe a certain player and their positive, impact, a lot of the time you'll hear people say, he's the first person and he's the first person in and he's the last person off the training pitch. That's not always a good thing. And that's where it's a really nice line for the media. It's a really nice line to read in a newspaper, on social media, whatever. But it comes, I think I was mentioning this before, it comes back to why you're here and what we're doing in a day to get to where we want to get to. And that's something I learned later on in my career, that actually, do you know what? There's no awards for being the person who's the last person at the training ground. There's no awards for being the first in. The award is for progress. And if you are in for 2 hours and you've maximized those 2 hours and you've done everything you need in those 2 hours, that's absolutely fine. Go home. Don't stay an extra 2 hours in the gym, or, whatever, if what you're doing doesn't have a real purpose, because over time it could also be dead time. And ultimately you go back to what you were saying, Ben, about 3 game weeks in the women's game, and they're matching the men's sort of calendar now. Yeah, in those 3 game weeks, probably the most integral thing is recovery. And actually there's a huge value in being at home on the sofa, or having a nap, or being in the pool off feet, that is going to prepare you, for the games those weeks. So I think it's not always a good thing to be, one of these people that gets labelled, first in, last out sort of thing. I'm a big believer in quality, not quantity. And that's something I learned in my latter stages of my career, but that's normal. It comes with experience. You know how to manage your body. Whereas young players, you'll know, working with young players, like, the only thing they want ever in life is game time. Just want to play. I just need minutes. I want to play. I should be playing. I need minutes. Well, actually, let's train. Because you break it down the week and you go, how many minutes are you training per week? How many minutes are there in a match? 90. How many minutes are you training per week? 300-400 minutes on the grass. What's more important? What can you control more? It's the minutes in training. Show that consistency to then get minutes in a game. And there's a really interesting study in women's football at the moment. I guess a question to you guys, just, George, you might know the answer to this. What's the average age for a young female player to achieve 100 plus WSL minutes in a season?
It'll probably be quite young, I would guess, because the players are coming through a little bit earlier, I would suggest, in the women's game. But I don't know. I don't have a figure off the top of it.
So 100 plus minutes. If you're a young player, you get 5-10 minutes here and there chomping at the bit. It's actually really surprising. It's not that young.
Okay.
It's 23, which I was quite alarmed by that stat. So it takes. So if you've got an 18-year-old breaking into a first team, it might be in 5 years' time before they play more than 100 minutes in a WSL season, which just goes to show patience is a virtue.
I was going to say that's really interesting in terms, because we've spoken again recently about players being put into first teams at very young ages, even 16, 17, and starting games. And you'll see it now, won't you, in the men's game as well? Like, you see these super young players suddenly ended up in 2-3 game weeks at such a young age, where they're essentially still in an academy program.
Yeah.
It's really interesting that is the case, because maybe that is beneficial at this moment in time for those players to take time to get those minutes.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, because you look at players in the Premier League, like Archie Gray, for example, at Tottenham. He's 18 and he's consistently played for the last 15 plus fixtures for Tottenham. Now, I would imagine there's a physical conversation in that, as a growth and maturation conversation. Is he ready for that? And he obviously is, because he's been playing, he's been doing really well. But it's just interesting that the curbing the enthusiasm of young players and getting them to buy into the longevity of the project of being a professional, a senior pro for 10 to 15 years, actually doesn't happen overnight. And that's why the loan system in the women's game right now is thriving. But my point is, well, it goes whole separate podcast, make the league bigger, more teams, and then you don't need to use the loan system as much, because people are, as much as players are developing, coaches are developing as well. And if you're a coach at a club that's in, say, the bottom half of the table, and you're trying to embed your style and philosophy, how do you do that with lone players all the time? Like, you got a player come in for 6 months and they go back to their parent club, or they're on loan for the season and they go back. It's not always, it's good for the players to get minutes if they're ready for that, but also for the longevity of the game. I'm like, well, we need to make the league bigger, 14 to 16 teams, perhaps reduce the loan system and increase the quality in squads to compete throughout the whole season. So it's an interesting thing, but I just found that very interesting in terms of the average age is actually bigger than older than what people probably would perceive. And getting money in the bank, if you like, minutes in the legs, however you want to call it, it's a virtue.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point there. And there's loads of names that came to mind. The reason I think I said younger was because I still follow certainly Liverpool women quite closely. And there's a lot of players who we had as 12s there who have broken through. Lucy Parry being one that springs to mind straight away. Hannah Silcock, who came through and then went straight out on loan to Blackburn, like you said. So that use of the loan system has been utilised quite a lot. But the one thing I really wanted to ask you, and I know we've skirted around the issue of ACLs and injuries and things. I work with a player down here, and we saw it literally yesterday with the FA Women's Plate and some of the competitions going on. Bournemouth Women's first team played Man United Academy a couple of weeks ago. We had Portsmouth's essentially under 23s. There were 16, 17, 18-year-old girls playing Moneyfield's first team and things like this. And just because I worked with one of the players at Portsmouth, they had 3 or 4 injuries just off the back of that game because they were 16, 17-year-old girls playing fully grown women. And lo and behold, some of them, so I think one ended up in hospital, potential hip, serious injury, and a few others that were just pure contact to contact. And it was just a case of a fully grown woman versus a child, essentially. My opinion is you see that more in the women's game still happening. And I agree with you. I think it's probably because there aren't enough teams and the league structure is so small that more teams would make that a bit more of an even playing field, if you like. So in your opinion, what can we do? Because to us as S&C coaches, it's quite obvious. If you're playing a 16-year-old versus a 32-year-old, fully grown woman, there's only one winner in a 50-50 there. From a player's point of view and somebody who's now got a real interest in this and has experienced it at the top level, what can we do to try and just reduce some of those numbers of injuries and things like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question and a very difficult one to answer and find. There's people out there like FIFA Pro doing some exceptional work behind the scenes, studies to try and get the answers or try and get closer to getting towards the answers. But I always think, like, if I was to go and take in a role, in a first team now as a coach, my number one prerogative would be we need to get the data of Champions League matches, physical data of a Champions League knockout game. And then we need to get the data of the average WSL game. And then we need to train at intensity of a Champions League fixture. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, but you go off, metrics that you want to look at. It might be meters per minute, via the GPS data, hitting big numbers in those modified games at training are the way to push players safely, expose them safely to high intensities, and demand that from a football coach's perspective. Your job is to demand and to provide an environment where the players are really hungry to compete with each other in training first, and then you can start then competing in WSL fixtures, and then you can start pushing for Champions League. But I always think that if your goal is to get to the Champions League, you need to start playing and training like a Champions League footballer before you're there. Now, there's experts in many different fields. Athlete female health is a big one at the moment. Finding ways to manage the menstrual cycle and the symptoms around that so that players are not losing training days because of symptoms. It's huge. Again, if you lose a big training day a week, you might then be falling behind. So it's all about finding experts, using the experts on a level playing field to provide the best possible training environment for the players to excel and push boundaries every day safely. So that exposure, like you say as well, you go back to the loan system of players that have come through, for example, Liverpool, and they've been on loan at Blackburn or Burnley or Stoke City. It's a big jump. It's a change. The girls in the academy that I coach now, they play against boys teams. You know, we facilitate games against boys sides to get that safe physical exposure and the feeling of losing. Adversity is important, but it's all done safely. Now, we're really lucky. We're probably one of the best academies in the country at City, probably the top 3. But how's everyone else doing? That's the key. And obviously at grassroots level and you know, PGA level, it's so important that the resources are there to build environments to prepare for the first team. So time also helps. But yeah, it's, if you had to ask me one thing, it's about exposing safely to higher level of intensity of training.
How much do you put, you mentioned into it and alluded to it as well, that from an early age you were strength training. How much do you put down to that? Because personally, just my own opinion, my gut feeling is that the training age, like you said there, of strength training from a younger age isn't quite there yet. So how much do you put it down to that sort of exposure as well? Because like I said earlier, players might be coming into an academy system, you know, back in the day with the RTC, and they're only really getting gym work to a certain standard for sort of potentially 14s to 16s. Now, obviously, Man City and the top academies, like you said, they're really well run and really well structured. But like you said, how's everyone else? So, do you think it is start early and make sure it's consistent?
100%. I would definitely hang my hat on that as well. The consistency, the foundations, the strength for life type approach, and also the other thing as well is personal ownership and accountability, which is something, again, it's innate. It comes, it's within you as an aspiring footballer, as an aspiring athlete, to, you know, it's all well and good having an hour slot for gym. Like, we speak a lot about this at Man City Academy. We have 6 till 7 gym, S&C. Like, what are you doing in that hour? Are you doing your sets properly? Are you training properly? Are you chit-chatting, dancing in between? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a complete loser, and I do massively advocate for fun and games, and, you know, everyone likes to dance when they're in the gym because you're feeling yourself a little bit. But I think that it's how do you use that hour to better yourself? And that's you get all of the work, all the legwork that gets put in behind the scenes of the staff, the academy managers, to facilitate a gym slot, 6 till 7, right? That's our time. Players now, ownership's on you. Use the time to step out of the gym, maybe a little bit stronger than when you stepped in. And that's the mindset now where we're in. And if it's one of those, it's harsh, but it's true. If it's not for you, it's fine. You can go to another club, and it's hard, but that's where we're at now. Elite football, it's hard, it's competitive, and it's, you know, squeeze all the juice out the lemon type of approach. Like, get what you can out of that hour. And you can't have somebody telling you what to do all the time. There's got to be that personal, intrinsic motivation. It's almost, you know, self-determination theory. It's the task-orientated individual. I want to be better, so I'm going to try my hardest. I'm going to have fun along the way. But, you know, this might help me improve my performance and get close to where I want to be.
Superb. Izzy, I'm wary of time, and we've spoken.
Sorry, I chat for ages.
I don't know, you've got to get to training, so
yeah.
I appreciate you coming on and doing this. I think getting your perspective, like we said, we've gone into coaching a little bit, but I think that the players, your playing career, is fascinating to just pull some of the perspectives from, and especially, like I said, with your knowledge of S&C and sports science. So thank you for opening up and being honest with us, and I'm sure the listeners will take a hell of a lot from it.
No, thanks so much for having me on, guys. I mean, you are the experts, and you're probably laughing at what I've been saying, feeling like she's so off. But no, it's awesome to chat about it. It's such an important subject as well because the game is growing and there's so much fun to be had out there for young players.
100%. Well, thank you very much for your time, and we'll best of luck for the rest of the season as well.
Thanks so much, guys. Awesome to chat.
Jordan, that was one of them episodes that I felt like we could have probably kept going, couldn't we, for hours. We had loads of questions for Izzy, but I thought the way she spoke about her perspective of S&C sports science, I think there was a lot to take away in terms of how to operate as practitioners and how to get players on side as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's one of those where you could say not every player is going to be the same as Izzy and be like, oh yeah, no, S&C is really important. You need to start from an early age and like, sing from the same song sheet that all of us as S&C coaches would. But again, it's just very refreshing to hear that there are players that do buy into it. There are players that do understand why we're doing it. And I think the bits she was talking about in terms of the best practitioners she's worked with, the traits and characteristics of those practitioners, they weren't groundbreaking. They were basics. They were have attention to detail, show that you care, be consistent, and repeat the process. That process, just continually do those sorts of things. It wasn't like, bring in new innovation all the time and, bring in the latest software and the latest firmware and all these sorts of fancy gadgets and gizmos. It was just, again, it's soft skills, people skills, as we know. So, yeah, really, really impressive. And I think the point I was making at the start about what she said in terms of how the FA were really supporting the clubs, I'm glad she said that because, like I said, I felt that from doing both roles essentially in the FA and the women's club at the time. And it's really interesting now to see that when she's in a top academy and a top club working with some real top players, that she feels that's really sort of the FA have sort of dragged the standard of club football up for women in this country and young girls, which is essentially it's really, really powerful. And I said it on a previous podcast, but you go down to a playing field or a park, and I know certainly down here, there's women's teams and women's games going on and girls' games going on that wouldn't have been going on 5-6 years ago. There's clubs now that exist that probably wouldn't, and like boys' academies or boys' grassroots teams that now have a full girls, sort of grassroots setup throughout the age groups that they wouldn't have existed 5-6 years ago. So that explosion of the women's game, I think, has been really impressive to see. But the fact that even as a player and now as a coach and a pundit, she's also saying those same things, I think is a really like positive thing to know that the future of women's football is only going in the right direction.
We spoke a lot, haven't we, about the physical side, about the changes in physicality. But I think she made a really good point at the start about it now, the demands on the technical and tactical side as well, which is really interesting. Like it's got to a point where physicality is okay, but everyone's in a similar sort of boat, like that preparation that players are doing away from the pitch for the game, they're all doing. So it's not a case of being able to get that edge so much physically. It's more, there's a lot more that goes into it from that, which I'm sure goes into her coaching as well. Like I said, there was probably a million different things we could have probably asked her off the back of what we spoke about, and that would have been definitely one of them. But I think that has to transfer into coaching, and especially coaching at that age group that she's working at in terms of 16s, getting those girls ready to step up into first team environments. It will definitely be an important factor.
Yeah, and it's like I said, the training age element of it. There's still going to be quite a big gap that the bigger clubs are obviously going to be able to expose the youngest players to S&C early because they'll be able to have practitioners in those roles, an under 12s and under 14s, physical performance coach, whereas a semi-professional women's side probably won't be able to do that. So you go, there's still a lot to do, but again, it's getting better. And just in the space that when I left women's football to where it is now, I know that has improved. And obviously we had Danny on the podcast as well, who's essentially in my old role, Liverpool Ladies, and they were saying, we've got more practitioners now than we had when I was there. So it is, the investment's getting there, which is good. And I think she made that point, didn't she, where she started S&C at an early age and went with her mum, and lo and behold, and getting touchwood, a lot of factors in there, multifactorial, we know, but apart from some serious contact injuries, she survived some major injuries across a career, which is really impressive.
Yeah, 100%. No, big thank you to Izzy for coming on. Yeah, it was a really enjoyable episode. Just last thing from us, just make sure you go and check out our sponsors. That's the Good Prep, Hawking Dynamics, Bridge Athletic, and Hytro. And we'll be back again next week, episode 328. Thanks, Jordan.
No worries. See you next week.